Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I am Brian Kelly, the CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications for SBAM. Today is Monday, August 15th. Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'd like to take a quick minute to thank our sponsor, Marana Group, for helping make this show possible. So Brian, let's dive into the topics of the day. I think one of the big items on the table is this Inflation Reduction Act. It's passed and is on its way to President Biden's desk for signature. So what would this act do to actually reduce inflation?
Yeah, I think the title that they gave it, the Inflation Reduction Act, was mainly like a marketing thing. There really isn't anything in the act itself that anybody would expect would have an impact on inflation. I did read one some economists in a business school that had looked at potentially 0.1% of impact if it resulted in some deficit reduction overall and state and federal government didn't increase spending elsewhere or something like it. So in other words, probably none. There are several things that this act will do, but reduce inflation. It doesn't really even seem to have anything remotely related to inflation in it. So that's really monetary policy. Overall, federal spending can have, as we've seen in the past, can have some impact on inflation. But in this case, additional spending, additional taxes to go along with it. So kind of a wash there in terms of inflationary impact. So I think the short answer is none.
All right, so what are some of the movements of this act?
Yeah, it does have included in it a subsidy for the purchase of electric vehicles, and it's only at certain price points. And there's some debate on how many of the cars out there on the market today will actually qualify for this. Now, it's just those that are made in the U.S. So before, it was only those by union shops. That was not included in the final bill, but it is just for those that are manufactured here in the U.S. So have to go through a lot of detail, what's manufactured in the U.S. and not, content requirements, all that kind of stuff. But so there is a subsidy for the purchase of electric vehicles as part of it. Altogether, the legislation is projected to raise about $740 billion in new revenue and about $440 billion in new spending. So the idea is that about $300 billion, if nothing else changes with federal spending, $300 billion potentially in deficit reduction, which I think, again, if there was something that somebody pointed to and said, well, that could help with inflation, technically maybe, but there are tax provisions though in the bill which institute a minimum tax on larger companies, and then also some pretty big changes when it comes to just the size and scope of the IRS, and the collection of tax revenue on existing tax policy is a pretty big part of the overall revenue, which would be achieved by essentially catching tax cheaters is the concept. But there's a lot of gray area in the tax code, and the idea of there being stepped up audit, enforcement through audits is the most likely impact of the overall bill when it comes to the IRS. I've seen some numbers that somewhere around 87,000 new IRS agents would be hired for the enforcement of this, which I think, generally speaking, for pass-through entities, which are not audited as often as other types of entities, when they say they're targeting those at $400,000 and over, the idea of tax returns that have pass-through income from business, such as LLCs and S corporations, seems like a likely target. So I think that's going to be the part that is probably going to matter the most to us.
So what are some of the other impacts that small businesses might see from this act?
Yeah, I think that small businesses will, on the tax enforcement, will be the biggest kind of direct impact that they'll see with respect to the act. A lot of the other provisions are they're really geared toward or aimed toward other lines of business. One thing that was kind of interesting though was that while it is billed as a climate change, dealing with climate change or reducing climate change in the future, the fossil fuel companies, like the big oil corporations, seem to not have a big problem with it. So I think it would be interesting to get to the bottom of exactly how, normally that's a place where they're kind of head to head. So I think on the energy front, where we all have a stake, any entity of any size, on the energy front, well, we've got a little more digging to do to get to the bottom of it. But I think the IRS enforcement for small business is going to be the key area that has a direct impact on the types of businesses that would be members of an association like ours.
All right, let's talk a bit about the upcoming election. The primaries behind us, all eyes are now on November. And we're going to see 6 potential questions that will be on the ballot. Can you share what voters can expect to see?
Yeah, we'll start with the one that we know for sure will be on the ballot because the legislature voted to put it on the ballot as a constitutional amendment to change term limits. Now, there are other ways that something can end up on the ballot, and that's collecting signatures, and the number of signatures required depends on whether it's an amendment to the Constitution or what's called a citizens initiative, which is just a statute put in place initiated by collecting signatures. So the one that I think is most likely, in addition to the term limits proposal, is the reproductive freedom for all. This has to do with the Roe versus Wade and abortion issue. This would be a constitutional amendment. It turned in about 740,000 signatures. Not the sort of thing that SBAM would get involved in or take a position on, but very likely to be on the ballot. There's actually 2 competing proposals that would change voting rules. One called Promote the Vote 2022. The other called Secure My Vote, Secure My Vote. One promoted by the Democrats, one promoted by the Republicans, to change the rules. Everything from how the absentee and identification and that sort of thing rules, those types of rules work in our voting procedures. There is a raise the wage proposal as well that would raise the minimum wage beyond where it is today. Now we've got a separate court case. You've heard us talk about this other court cases. The minimum wage is going to go from a little under $10 up to $12. This proposal would increase it to $15, and that will looks pretty likely to be on the ballot, but not until 2024, I think. But they've gone through the process of collecting signatures and turning it in, and then also the Let My Kids Learn initiative, which would provide tax credits for sending kids to private schools, and that's been a long-standing battle. Support for parents sending their kids to non-public schools has been a battle that's been around in Michigan for a long time. Our Constitution actually has a provision that makes it difficult for any public support to go to a private school. And this initiative would be, while it's not a constitutional amendment, this initiative seeks to accomplish that. So lots of things on potentially on the ballot for us to sort through. The minimum wage, which we would oppose, an increase in the minimum wage, and the term limits change that would essentially, I think, result in a more experienced House of Representatives in the long term, which we support, would be the 2 that you should expect to hear from SBAM on over the course of the future. The one that has to do with abortion, and the two that have to do with the voting procedures are the types of issues that we wouldn't likely to get involved in. My experience is that when you have that many proposals hit all at the same time, that often they all face a bigger uphill battle, because it's just a lot for voters to sort through. There's going to be a lot of mixed messaging for or against, and especially on the voting rights ones, where the Republicans and Democrats have wholly different approaches to it. I think it is going to be a pretty confusing set of initiatives for people to deal with.
And then you talked about there being a campaign out there to actively oppose the term limits proposal. So what could those efforts bring?
Yeah, so we had a task force of small businesses that reviewed the term limits proposal and determined that having a change in the way our term limits work, so that instead of 6 years in the House and 8 years in the Senate, make it so that you could serve 12 years all together, and all in the House, all in the Senate, split between the two, would likely result in a more experienced House, and something that we think would generally, on balance, be better. The question was, is anybody going to spend for or against this proposal? And that's still an open question. But a ballot committee was filed, which was filed to oppose the term limits change. So there'll at least be some kind of effort to oppose the change in term limits. I think there'll be a fairly robust effort to support it as well, and so that's one that I think there'll be a vigorous debate, and it'll be interesting because, unlike many other issues, this is one where it doesn't line up on regular Republican versus Democrat battle lines. This is one where I think you'll have support and opposition on both sides of that proposal. But the fact, I think it's significant that a ballot initiative or a ballot committee was formed to oppose this change, which means there'll be a contest of some sort.
All right, let's do a quick update on some COVID guidance. The CDC made some updates at the end of last week. So what's the latest?
When it comes to the COVID changes, that I think the overall context was the most important. So we'll talk about some of the details, but the overall context was that I think acknowledgement that we're in the endemic phase. Now at SBAM, we've been talking about this for almost a year now, but the idea that it's not a pandemic to be beat. It's a matter of this going from a pandemic to endemic, where it's just kind of a seasonal thing that is here to stay. And in fact, that's what the CDC said for the first time, that COVID-19, or the derivatives of COVID-19, are here to stay. And that means that we start to move away from COVID-specific guidance and just treat it more like we would any other type of seasonal sickness. And so things like quarantine and isolation recommendations, especially as it pertains to schools. Many schools still were doing contact tracing and had an expectation of isolation once an exposure happened, even if somebody wasn't sick, but they've been exposed, recommendation of isolation. Those types of recommendations go away from the CDC. I think that it won't necessarily be warmly embraced by everybody to kind of get back to normal, if you will. But the way that the world has been moving, I think that the CDC is really just kind of working to catch up with where the world kind of already is. So a good indication that the pandemic era CDC rules are behind us, and this acknowledgement seems to I think is a substantial demarcation of time where it's it's more the common sense of, hey, if you're sick, stay home, and if you're not sick, then you don't need to stay home. I mean, if you go to the CDC website, it's not quite as simple as I just laid it out, but that's, generally what the guidance is moving forward. Now, save for healthcare, still always going to be separate rules for healthcare, but for the rest of us, I think it's really pretty straightforward now.
That will be particularly helpful for working parents navigating schools this fall. So good time. People will be out on for big lengths of time, hopefully. All right. Speaking of the workplace, there's a new buzz phrase that has making the rounds, and that is called quitting. And this was new to me when I was preparing content for today's newsletter. So if you've already read today's small, might know what quiet quitting is, but I really wasn't sure until I read the article and was reading more, and it's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, so this concept of quiet quitting is one that it has to do with people that they're not leaving their jobs, they're not actually quitting their jobs, but they stop trying. And so they might be showing up, putting them in the minimum amount of effort in order to just get by, and no longer really carrying their weight. And so when we have great content that comes from our partners that deal with employers all over the place. And so as we're pulling this one in, it was interesting, and I thought enough to bring up in this briefing, and even invite maybe some comments if anybody has any experience with this, where you've had a case where maybe in the past you've had somebody that was done and they quit, but in this case they didn't quit, but they might as well have because are no longer really doing the work or carrying the load. So this is it's a new phrase, and one that had kind of worked its way up through our content development process, because employers are talking about this as being a problem around the country. So curious to hear if any of our viewers and our members have run across this type of a scenario where somebody has for all intents and purposes quit working, but is still drawing a paycheck from you.
It's fascinating. I think Brian and I are two people it's kind of shocking that people can actually do that. So, all right, let's talk about Data Monday.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the slides here, and it is there's several kind of interesting things I wanted to cover today. First is, you might remember last week we talked about a stronger than expected jobs report, and always inside and outside of these jobs reports, some things are up and some things are down. I thought it was kind of interesting, the things that were up the most in that jobs report, support activities for mining. If all this work toward batteries and electrification, the stuff to make that possible is in the ground. And so it's just kind of interesting to see that is one of the hot areas, along with oil and gas extraction. Of course, when prices are up, it makes it more cost effective to get at more oil and gas that and harder to get places. And so a few of the areas that we've seen bigger than expected jobs gains, both clothing and accessory sales and stores, along with textile, the manufacturing were a couple of the areas that were down, but not as the downs weren't the biggest downs were not as big as the biggest ups. So overall, a positive jobs report for last month. But this is the one that caught my attention here. The business support services was one of the bigger ones in terms of absolute jobs down. And business support services, of course, includes a lot of small businesses exist to do business-to-business support. So just that one in particular caught my attention. This shows month by month the U.S. average hourly earnings from among all employees and how much they're going up. This is a percentage on a monthly basis, and so you see there's an upward trend that's happening. So this would dovetail really closely with what we saw with that jobs report. So there is still upward pressure on wages. because there's still job creation happening and demand that companies are trying to meet. And this is the reason why we I think really have kind of locked in place now an expectation that the Federal Reserve will continue to pretty aggressively increase interest rates, because if there's increased pressure on wages, that means that there's likely to be inflation is still going to be a concern. This is a different way of looking at the increased wages, though. This is the unit labor costs, and this isn't just looking at wages, but it's the cost per unit of production, and this is up as high as it's been since 1982. And what this means is that when you see wages going up, but productivity doesn't go up with it, then the cost per unit produced goes up. And that is really a recipe for inflation. So the cost is going up without productivity going up. So it just means it's more expensive per unit, no matter what unit we're talking about here. So this is across the US economy. And so I thought it's pretty interesting when you compare that. Wages are going up, but if wages went up and productivity went up at the same time, then there's no downside to that. But if wages go up at a time when productivity isn't increasing, that's when you see this cost per unit go up, and therefore price increase pressures. So we also see in the just, I don't know if I'd call it a bright spot or not, but in terms of the cost of food for the World Food Price Index actually is down off its high. And so that's good. It's still really high. Don't get me wrong. It doesn't mean that food inflation is back to normal. It just means that the rate that it is above, it stopped going up, and the inflation rate each month stopped going up, and has actually settled down a little bit lower. Would love to see a couple months in a row of a downward trend here. I think that would really mean something. So again, a little bit of a bright spot. If I look at last month's some of the big movers, or at least the things that people would care a lot about in terms of the CPI, you'll notice here that this average is still high. Is why we see interest rates going up. But fuel, oil, gasoline, we've seen gasoline prices come down, but still high. All of these fuel, oil, gasoline, natural gas, all very, very high. Airfare, not a lot of signs that airfare is going to come down a lot, because there are other issues, shortages at play there. But here's you can see some of the bigger items, but you also see some of these items like motor vehicle maintenance and repair, that in used cars and trucks. Those were above the average before, now below the average. So it means, I think that there's at least some signs starting to kind of peek through a little bit that that inflation may be kind of, we're getting to a point of cresting, and who knows, maybe we'll see it start to come down. So I don't think there's any way we're going to escape another rate increase from the Feds at this point because of the upward pressure on costs from labor. But still, I see a few glimmers of hope in this most recent data. And then I thought, we don't share a lot on the stock market here, because the economy and the stock market are not the same thing. But I thought it was notable that the S&P 500 has gained back about half of what it lost in the bear market. So that's obviously any individual stock may or may not have done okay, but gained back half. But in terms of the S&P 500, which is kind of a decent indication of the U.S. economy as a whole, the companies in the U.S. economy as a whole, at least those publicly traded, have gained back about half of that value that they had lost. So again, I feel like a month ago, Data Monday was like all bad news, and I'd say in this case it's 25% good news. So it's an inching forward, and maybe a little bit of hope that some of these complications are, that there's light at the end of the tunnel. Now, that's not to say that we will not still face a contracting economy, a recession for the rest of the year, but there is enough pent-up demand that it could be that it's the type of recession that doesn't look or feel like it had in the past, because that pent-up demand is being met, kind of carrying us through the place where the new demand is a little bit weaker.
All right, well, thanks for that glimmer of hope. A couple of things before we say goodbye today. I want to let everyone know that SBAM's golf outing is coming up on September 15th. We're going back to the Medal course in Marshall. It's a fantastic course, or so I'm told. I don't golf, but it looks beautiful and people seem to have a good time. So you can learn more on our website. And the other item I wanted to let y'all know about is that we have opened nominations for the 4th annual Snyder Spirit of Entrepreneurship Award. So Brian, I don't know if you want to say a few things about that award, and then we'll go ahead and drop the nomination info in the chat.
The Rick Snyder Spirit of Entrepreneurship Award is something that has been around now for I think this will be the 4th year that it's in place, and it's meant to really capture a turnaround story. And when this is before my time at SBAM, by the way, when my predecessor had come up with the idea of an award featuring a turnaround, because Rick Snyder had really led the turnaround of Michigan from the lost decade to a decade of growth in so many ways. To do an award to a business that has been faced with a tough challenge and kind of had to turn things around and reinvent itself, and so that's what this award is for. Something we recognize at our Leadership Council meeting every fall. And we'll drop a link in the comments so that you can, if you have somebody in mind or want to nominate yourself for consideration of that would be awesome. You'd be in great company. We have recognized some pretty awesome small businesses over the last few years in this, and it's just incredible stories. Some having to do with the pandemic, but not just that, and other types of turnarounds and reinventions as well. That's the great thing about the entrepreneurial spirit, is that it just keeps on pushing forward and figures out a way.
All right, well, that's all we have for you today. A wonderful week, and we'll see you back here next Monday.
See you on Monday, everybody.